The Barbarian, Chapter 1, Part 5. As dawn broke, a soft and ethereal light filtered through the canopy, painting the forest in hues of gray and pale green. The birds began their morning chorus, and the cool, crisp air bit at the barbarian's skin. He rose and made his way back towards the outskirts of the settlement. Soon he saw Ronald, Benton, and Harold near the edge of the clearing, their figures silhouetted against the rising sun. They were already geared for the hunt, and their expressions were grim but resolute as they waited for him. The barbarian approached the waiting trappers, and they watched him as he pulled Kenny from his pack. He set the goblin corpse gently on the ground, and his carved features were prominent in the morning light. With a callous thumb, he checked the tightness of the vine noose around his neck and ensured the macabre tether remained secure. "Give me a moment," he told Ronald and the others with a smile. "Need to make sure my gear's in order before we head out. Wouldn't want to be caught unprepared when facing that hellhound." The trappers nodded, but their weathered faces were unreadable in the dim light. Ronald grunted and replied, "Take your time. It is important we remain prepared. We've got a beast to hunt." They continued their own preparations as they checked arrows, sharpened knives, and secured their gear. Kenny lay at the barbarian's feet, his vacant stare fixed on nothing. Benton glanced at the drake, carved into his chest, and nervously watched as the barbarian tightened the noose. "All right," he announced to the waiting trappers. He dismissed the morbid, unwitting look Benton was giving him as he put on his pack and grabbed Kenny's noose. "I'm ready. Let's go find this hellhound." Ronald nodded at him as he slung his bow on his shoulder. "About time. This way." He turned and led the small group into the dense woods. Benton and Harold followed close behind, and their eyes scanned the forest with a practiced wariness. The hunt had truly begun, and the eerie silence of the deeper woods closed in around them. "I don't think we ever caught your name, stranger," Ronald said flatly as he kept his eyes ahead. It suddenly occurred to the barbarian. He did not know his own name. There was a moment of silence before he thought of one to give to himself. "Phut!" he finally answered. "Phut Buckerson," he said with a delinquent smile. Ronald and the others just looked at him awkwardly for a moment. Ronald just shrugged his shoulders and looked forward. "Fine, if you don't want to tell us your real name, I don't care." Phut was actually impressed with the name he had just given to himself on account of the amnesia that had barely bothered him, even at this point. He thought now that not remembering one's name would be mentally debilitating to many, but Phut Buckerson did not care. After a few minutes of silence, and the barbarian's reflective train of thought, he fell into step beside Ronald. The sounds of their footsteps on the forest floor, and the rustle of Kenny as Phut dragged him, were the only sounds to the quiet morning until the barbarian broke the silence. "Do you think that innkeeper was being a bit dramatic last night?" Phut looked at Ronald as he grunted, but he did not look at him, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. He took a moment. A slight smirk appeared on his face. Dramatic. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, or perhaps a very lively corpse, he replied with a dry amusement in his tone. "Most folks aren't used to seeing a man sharing an ale with, well, with your friend there. It was certainly a sight, Buckerson. Had the whole place in a proper tizzy." He shook his head slightly, and a low chuckle escaped him. "But dramatic? Nah, he just wanted you gone before you scared off the rest of his customers." A deep, guttural laugh rumbled from Futt's chest, and the sound echoed through the trees. He clapped Ronald on the shoulder, and the force of the gesture made him stumble slightly. "Ha! Yeah, probably right. Scared the life right out of him. He looked like he was gonna shit his pants," he agreed. Futt then turned his gaze towards Benton and Harold, who were walking a little behind, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and reluctant amusement. "What about you two?" he asked as he gestured vaguely towards Kenny, who was still being dragged along. "Think he was overreacting?" Benton shifted his weight nervously, and his eyes flicked from Futt to Kenny and back. "Well," he started, his voice a bit reedy. "It was unusual, sir. Most folk don't bring their dead friends to the inn. Made some of us a bit uneasy, truth be told." Harold, ever the stoic, simply grunted and gave a curt nod, his gaze steady and unreadable. He offered no opinion beyond a silent acknowledgement of the oddity. They seemed more focused on the task at hand than on the innkeeper's plight. The barbarian spoke, and his voice cut through the light-hearted mood, sharp and serious. "Kenny is not my friend," he stated, and his tone left no room for misinterpretation. The laughter died on his lips and was replaced by the grim reality of his journey and his unique companion. Ronald paused his stride for a moment and looked back at him with a measured look, then continued walking without a word. Benton visibly flinched, his eyes widening slightly. He quickly looked away, perhaps unnerved by the finality in Futt's voice. Harold remained impassive, and his heavy footsteps played a steady rhythm in the quiet woods. The moment of levity had passed, replaced by the stark, somber truth of Futt Buckerson's relationship with the corpse he dragged. The hunt for the hellhound continued, and the seriousness of the task seemed to underscore the barbarian's words. Futt flashed a wide, toothy grin, and his previous seriousness melted away. "Just joking," he boomed, and the outburst echoed a little too loudly in the quiet woods. "Of course Kenny's my friend. Best traveling companion a man could ask for. Never complains, always listens, and he's good for a map." Futt patted Kenny's stiff, carved back with a loud thwack. Ronald let out a short, dry chuckle and a shake of his head, indicating his bemusement. "Right," he said with a hint of weariness in his voice, but a flicker of understanding too. Benton, however, still looked a little bewildered, and his eyes darted between Futt and the dead goblin. Harold continued his steady march, unfazed by the sudden shift, and his silence spoke volumes. The air, which was momentarily thick with confusion, now lightened slightly, though an underlying current of oddness remained. Futt grinned wider as he brought up his axe, the edge glinting in the dappled sunlight. "Speaking of," he exclaimed and pulled Kenny closer, then dropped face down in the cold mud of the forest floor with a wet thud. With practiced, deliberate strokes, Futt began to carve new lines into Kenny's stiff hide. The winding path he had taken since he left the river, the rough outline of the settlement, and a crude symbol for the direction they were now headed, north, towards the ridge. The scraping sound of the axe against hardened goblin flesh was the only sound in the quiet forest. Ronald and the others watched, and their expressions were a mixture of weary acceptance and morbid fascination, though none offered a comment. Kenny, as always, remained a silent canvas for the barbarian's macabre cartography. "Are there any other settlements close by I should add to old Kenny here?" Futt asked the trappers. Ronald glanced at Kenny's grotesque map, then back to the path ahead. "Aye, there's a few," he said as he tried not to laugh. If you head east from the Long Pine, follow the old logging road for a day or two, you'll hit a smaller place called Pendle. Mostly woodcutters and their families. Not much else there. Further south, down the river past where you came from, there's a larger town, Wellspring. Got a proper market and a few more inns. But it's a good 3 or 4 days' travel from here. Benton, eager to help, added, and if you keep going north, past where we're headed, you'll hit the foothills. Heard tell of some old mining camps up there, but they've been abandoned for years. Not much left, but ruins, and things best left undisturbed. He shivered slightly, not from the cool morning air. Harold simply nodded and confirmed the information with his usual stoic agreement. Foote nodded appreciatively at the trappers as the information registered in his mind. "Thanks," he said, his voice gruff. He positioned Kenny on his bent knee, his great axe ready. With focused effort, he began to carve, translating their directions into crude etchings on the goblin's hide. He cut a jagged line eastward for the logging road to Pendle, and a longer, more sinuous line southward for Wellspring. He added a few hastily drawn peaks that represented the northern foothills. The trappers offered no further commentary, and their attention already returned to the task at hand. Ronald signaled for them to move on, and they adjusted their pace, pushing deeper into the woods. Foote gave Kenny a final, solid pat, and looked at the new additions to his grim map. He grabbed the noose and resumed his place at the rear of the small procession as the forest floor muffled their footsteps. "Where you fellas from?" Foote asked, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. Ronald glanced back and his scarred cheek twitched slightly. "Harold and I hail from Pendle," he replied and pointed in a direction generally east of their current path. Benton and some of the others back at Long Pine came from Wellspring too. But we spend most of our time out here, tracking game and trapping for pelts. The woods are our home, for better or worse. Benton, trailing a bit behind, chimed in. "Aye, we know these woods like the back of our hands. That's why we reckon we've got a good chance against this hellhound." He said it with a mix of bravado and nervousness. Harold just grunted in agreement, his focus unwavering on the terrain ahead. Foote gave Benton a hearty slap on the back, which caused him to stumble slightly. "I like your gusto, Benton. I think Kenny does too, eh?" He turned his head towards Kenny and gave the noose a tug, expecting a response. "Isn't that right, Kenny?" Benton managed a weak, strained smile, clearly unsure how to react to imaginary praise and reassurance from a goblin corpse. He shook his head and acknowledged the absurdity of the moment as Ronald let out a long, suffering sigh. He pinched the bridge of his nose for a moment before he let his hand drop. "Just try not to let your gusto get us killed, Benton," he muttered, though there was a hint of annoyance for the barbarian's antics in his tone. Harold simply shook his head slowly, his gaze still fixed forward, as if trying to ignore the increasingly bizarre company he kept. The faint rustle of Kenny, as he was dragged behind, was the only reply from the dead companion. A familiar glint entered Foote's eye as he thought of a pointless joke. "Why did the goblin cross the road?" he asked. His voice boomed through the trees and eyes fixed on the unchanging expression of Kenny. He paused for dramatic effect and let the silence stretch. "To get to the other slide!" The barbarian let out another booming, deranged laugh and slapped his thigh. "Get it? Slide, because goblins are always sliding around in mud and their own muck. Ronald groaned softly and shook his head, unamused. Benton cringed as a nervous giggle escaped him. Harold remained impassive, his steady rhythm unbroken. Kenny, of course, offered no reaction, and his slack jaw seemed to mock Futt's attempt at humor. Yet the barbarian found a strange satisfaction in the act, his morbid companion the only one privy to his peculiar brand of wit. Futt's booming laugh echoed through the silent woods and created a stark contrast to the calm morning. He caught his breath from his laughter and continued his unhinged rant. "Of course you don't get it, Kenny, you dipshit," he roared as he gave the corpse's noose a violent tug. "You're the only goblin that slides in mud and muck because I drag you through it for fucking miles." The last words were punctually drawn out and emphasized with another burst of ludicrous laughter. Ronald pinched the bridge of his nose again, and a long-suffering sigh escaped him. Benton looked utterly bewildered, and his eyes widened as he glanced between Futt and his silent companion. Harold merely grunted and emitted a low sigh, which could have meant anything, from agreement to exasperation. The trappers exchanged quick, frightened glances at each other as they suddenly realized the barbarian's unusual disposition. Although they were conditioned to the eccentricities and hardships of the wilderness, they were not quite accustomed to the particular brand of the barbarian's sense of humor. The forest, however, remained indifferent to his boisterous banter. Futt turned his attention to Ronald again, the conversation about Kenny momentarily forgotten. "Do any of you fish?" Futt asked, recalling his own recent frustrating attempts to craft a fishing pole. Ronald nodded slowly. "Aye, when we can. Mostly small creeks and the calmer stretches of the river. Good way to supplement the meat from trapping. Benton's pretty handy with a line, actually." Benton blushed slightly at the unexpected compliment. "It's a quiet way to spend a few hours," he added. Harold, as usual, simply gave a terse nod of agreement as his eyes scanned the surrounding trees. Futt nodded solemnly and admitted a difficult truth. "I would have killed for a fishing pole and a hook a few days ago in the woods. I was fucking starving. Messed my hand up pretty good, trying to make one out there." Ronald nodded slowly, and his expression softened slightly, with a touch of understanding. "Aye, the woods can be unforgiving when you're caught unprepared," he said, his voice gruff, but not unkind. "Broke my thumb to a bear trap once, trying to rush the release. Had to learn to do most things one-handed for a spell." Benton chimed in, and his voice was still shaky. "That sounds awful. I'd have gone mad with hunger. We usually try to keep some dried rations handy, just in case." Harold offered a low grunt, a silent acknowledgement of the shared hardship of survival in the wild. The memory of his hunger and the futile attempts of crafting a fishing pole hung in the air for a few seconds. "You guys got a fishing pole I can buy from them when we get back in town?" Futt asked. Ronald considered his question for a moment as his gaze drifted over the dense undergrowth. "Might be, Buckerson," he mused. "We don't usually carry spares, but there's a fella in town, Old Man Headley. Makes good ones, he does. Sells them out of his shack near the river. Not sure what he charges these days, but it won't break your coin purse. Might even be able to talk him down a bit." Benton nodded eagerly. "Aye, Old Man Headley. His hooks are sharp, too. He'd likely have a few in stock." Ronald grunted his agreement. The prospect of a proper fishing pole, rather than another makeshift attempt, brought a flicker of hope to Futt's internal thoughts. He blinked rapidly with a sudden prickle in his eyes, and a single tear traced a path down his cheek, cutting through the grime. "Thanks," Futt managed. His voice was thick with uncharacteristic emotion. "You guys are a great help." He looked at the trappers with a newfound appreciation as he wiped the tear away. Ronald, who had become accustomed to the stoicism of the wilderness, looked distinctly uncomfortable. He shifted his weight as he cleared his throat and avoided Futt's gaze. It's nothing, Buckerson. Just common sense out here," he mumbled and rubbed the back of his neck. Benton looked equally bewildered, and his eyes were wide, realizing he had never seen a tear on a barbarian before. Harold, however, merely grunted, a surprisingly soft sound, then patted Futt's shoulder with a large, calloused hand before he returned his attention to the path. The moment of vulnerability passed as the forest deepened around them, and Futt thought it would be good to lighten the mood. He hummed a low, warbling tune, a strange melody that sounded raspy, like he needed to clear his throat. "Hey, Kenny, sing us one of your goblin songs," he urged with a tug on the noose. "Come on, don't be shy." Kenny, of course, remained silent. The only sounds were the rhythmic thud of his body against the earth as Futt walked. Ronald shook his head, and a faint, exasperated smile played on his lips. Benton bit his lip to keep from laughing, a nervous tremor in his shoulders. Harold let out a barely audible sigh, as if he had mentally added, "talking to dead goblins" to the list of things he was just going to have to accept. The forest fell quiet again, broken only by the steady pace of the hunting party. Suddenly, Futt cupped his hands over Kenny's ears, an absurd gesture given his state, as he turned to the trappers. "Have any of you ever killed a goblin before?" he asked. His voice was a conspiratorial whisper, as if the goblin carcass would overhear. Ronald raised an eyebrow as a look of disbelief crossed his weathered face at the barbarian's action. "Killed goblins? Aye, more than I can count, Buckerson," he stated plainly, without fanfare. "They're pests. Always have been. Benton, Harold, and myself all had our share of skirmishes with them." Benton nodded and had a grim expression on his face. "Nasty little buggers," he muttered. Harold grunted in agreement, and his hand instinctively went to the hilt of his knife. Futt slowly uncupped his hands from Kenny's ears, with a consoled look on his face. "No, Kenny, they haven't," he whispered as if he were sharing a secret. "I know. It's okay," he added in a louder, more reassuring tone. Then he patted his stiff back gently. Ronald let out a long, weary sigh and shook his head. Benton simply stared, with his mouth slightly agape, clearly unsure how to process the scene. Harold, however, merely glanced at Futt, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before he turned his gaze back to the path ahead. The trappers continued to walk, and the strange display became just another peculiar part of this unusual hunting party's journey into the deeper, more dangerous parts of the forest. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of unseen birds. The barbarian turned his attention away from Kenny and focused on the real quarry. "So, why call it a hellhound? Have any of you seen the beast?" His question cut through the quiet hum of the forest. Ronald shrugged as his eyes scanned the dense undergrowth. "That's what we call it." His voice was low and serious. "Because of its teeth, mostly. It's got fangs black as pitch, and a bite that can tear through thick hide like paper. And the hell part Well, it prefers the shadowed places, the deep woods where the light don't reach, stays hidden, strikes fast, then vanishes back into the shadows. Benton shivered and pulled his furs tighter around him. It moves like smoke through the trees, he added, his voice hushed. And the way it smells, like old blood and decay, even from a distance. Benton nodded slowly, and his hand instinctively went to the hilt of his hunting knife. The shift in their demeanor was palpable. The levity of earlier conversations replaced by the grim reality of their hunt. Foot scratched his chin, the rough stubble a familiar sensation. He remained quiet and absorbed the trapper's grim descriptions. The image of a creature with black fangs and a stench of decay lurking in the deepest shadows solidified in his mind. The earlier jokes and banter seemed distant now, replaced by a keen focus on the task ahead. The trappers continued their steady march, their senses heightened, their movements methodical. The forest around them grew quieter, denser, and the dappled sunlight struggled to penetrate the increasingly thick canopy. A subtle tension hung in the air, a palpable awareness of the unseen predator that could be watching the hunting party's approach. After some time of the quiet march, the barbarian felt a sudden shift in his gut. His stomach groaned loudly as he halted the procession with a grim, determined look on his face. "Hold on, everyone," he said. His voice was low, and his hand was in the air to signal the stop. The trappers turned to Fut with a question in their eyes. Fut held his stomach as he looked at Kenny and dropped the noose. He pulled his trousers down, and with a deliberate, unsettling movement, the barbarian went into a squatting position and defecated on the face of his cadaver companion. The slushy waste had missed the goblin's maw completely and landed on his eyes and forehead. Gravity pulled the excrement down the crown of Kenny's head, where it settled on the cold forest floor and steamed in the morning air. The foul odor immediately weighed heavy in the air, and was a stark violation of the clean forest morning. Ronald stopped instantly, and his eyes widened in disbelief before he quickly averted his gaze. It was a look of utter weariness settling on his face. He let out a long, shuddering sigh. Benton visibly gagged as he turned away and buried his face in his hands, his body rigid with revulsion. Harold paused for a fraction of a second, and his stoic expression faltered for a fleeting moment into something akin to disgust, before he resolutely turned his back and continued his march into the trees to distance himself from the scene. The forest became eerily silent, as if even nature recoiled from the act. The trappers tried their best to avoid eye contact when Fut looked at them, their faces a mixture of shock and profound discomfort. "Any of you got anything to wipe with?" Fut's voice was level and steady when he asked them, despite the lingering stench. Ronald slowly turned back, and his face was a mask of utter disbelief and revulsion. He shook his head and rubbed his temples with a trembling hand. "No, Buckerson. We don't carry anything for that." His voice was strained. Benton was still hunched over, clearly struggling not to vomit. Harold was still facing away, but he let out a low, guttural growl, a sound of deep, simmering disgust. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken judgment and a profound sense of awkwardness. Fut did not even feel the tension in the air as he nodded dismissively with a grimace of self-reliance on his face. "It's all right. I've got it." His voice was unnervingly matter-of-fact. With a chillingly deliberate motion, he grabbed Kenny's stiff, cold hand and proceeded to use it for its intended, revolting purpose. The unnatural rubbing and the sickening scraping sound were amplified in the sudden, horrified silence of the group. Ronald visibly recoiled and turned his back fully now, his shoulders tense. He muttered something inaudible, and his disgust was palpable. Benton retched, and his face went pale as he puked on the forest floor. He wiped his mouth with his wrist, and his eyes scrambled as he took a few steps back to put more distance between himself and the disgusting scene. Even Harold, the stoic, shifted his weight and his jaw tightened, a silent testament to the extreme nature of the barbarian's actions. The air itself seemed to grow heavy. It was thick with the feculent stench and the profound discomfort of the trappers, who now eyed Fut with a mixture of fear and absolute revulsion. The trappers looked to each other with great concern as they questioned the mental state of their barbaric companion. A sudden realization dawned on them now. They were deep in the woods with a bona fide psychopath. Fut pulled the vine noose, dragging Kenny forward once more, his body scraping against the forest floor. The grim purpose of the journey seemed to momentarily obscure the sheer horror of the defiled corpse for the trappers, though their unease was a palpable presence. "Well, let's carry on, shall we?" The barbarian's voice was remarkably steady after the unsettling task. After a moment of what seemed like internal debate, Ronald gave a curt, almost imperceptible shake of his head. His face was still pale as he avoided looking at Fut, and his gaze was fixed rigidly on the path ahead. Benton glanced at him, his eyes wide with a fear that went beyond the hellhound. He quickly looked away and hurried to catch up with Ronald. Harold, ever the silent observer, simply continued his steady pace. His jaw was clenched and his entire demeanor radiated a silent disapproval. The forest held its breath. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were muted, as the hunting party, now irrevocably changed by the barbarian's actions, pressed onward into the increasingly deep woods. "Much better now," Fut declared. He patted Kenny's desecrated form. "I'd bet you're starting to see why I keep Kenny around." Ronald stopped walking for a moment, and his eyes narrowed as he looked at him, then at the ghastly tableau of Kenny. His jaw was tight. "See why you keep him around, Buckerson," he repeated. His voice was flat, devoid of any humor. "I see why we're keeping our distance. That's what I see. We're hunting a monster, not playing with corpses. Let's focus on the damned task." He turned away sharply, his shoulders rigid. Benton whimpered softly, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and apprehension. He scurried in front of Harold to put more space between himself and Fut. Harold merely grunted, a sound that carried a heavy weight of disapproval, and continued his forward march. His pace quickened. The alliance, already strained by the barbarian's peculiar habits, felt even more fragile now. The trappers had gained more distance between themselves and the barbarian now. It was becoming clear to Fut they intended to abandon him here, deep in the wild forest. He watched with a predatory gaze as the gap between him and the trappers widened further. Ronald, now several yards ahead, walked with a stiff and rigid posture, his back resolutely turned. Benton practically clung to him. His shoulders were hunched, and he constantly glanced back at Fut with wide, fearful eyes, then quickly looked away. Harold had noticeably increased his pace, and his heavy boots crunched louder on the fallen leaves, eager to put more ground between himself and Fut's presence. Their silence was thick and deliberate, a clear refusal to engage further, their discomfort an unmistakable statement in the cool forest air. "Did I do something wrong, guys?" Fudd hollered with concern, and the question hung in the tense air between him and the trappers. Ronald stopped and turned to face him slowly, his eyes hard and cold. "Wrong, Buckerson?" he asked. His voice was low and tight with suppressed anger. "Nobody does. Did what you just did. It ain't right, not by any measure. We came out here to hunt a beast, not to watch. That." He gestured vaguely towards Kenny with a look of profound disgust twisting his features. Benton stared dreadfully at the barbarian, as if he were trapped in a corner with no escape. Harold merely shook his head and turned his back once more, his silence a heavy judgment. The forest seemed to press in, and the discomfort of the trappers was a palpable weight, leaving no doubt as to their feelings on the matter. After several seconds of tension, the barbarian asked an inappropriate question. "But it's funny, right?" Ronald turned and stared at him. His weathered face was a mask of disbelief and newfound frustration. He let out another long, aggressive sigh as he pinched the bridge of her nose. "Funny, Buckerson," he repeated coldly. No, it ain't funny. It's fucking disturbing. We're out here to hunt a dangerous beast, not to witness whatever that was. Keep your jests to yourself, barbarian. This is serious business." He turned his back again. His posture radiated a clear desire to put as much distance between himself and Fudd as possible. At this point, Benton began to believe the barbarian himself was no man, but a demon of sorts, sent from hell to lead him and his friends deep into the woods to antagonize them, and perhaps cause them harm. His new conviction brought a new level of emotion, and he began to cry. Ronald remained faced away as he put an arm around Benton's shoulders. The act was a small gesture of comfort in the cryptic plight that had besieged them. The camaraderie of the hunting party, already frayed, had finally snapped. The barbarian turned on Kenny with a furious glare fixed on his departed face. "Damn you, Kenny!" Fudd snarled as lifted the corpse by the noose. "This is all your fault." The words hung in the tense silence of the forest. The accused, silent and unmoving goblin said nothing to defend himself. Suddenly, Fudd began to jig the noose violently, as if it would spur a reply from the cold, scat-smeared corpse. Kenny danced like a morbid marionette, suspended in the air by his noose of the barbarian, his savage puppeteer. Ronald threw his hands up in exasperation. His face was a mix of anger and sheer bewilderment. He did not even bother to respond as he turned his back and quickly walked away, gaining a significant distance between him and Fudd. Benton, already a bundle of nerves, followed Ronald, practically running to catch up. Harold sneered and his massive frame radiated disapproval as he too quickened his pace, putting more and more space between himself and the barbarian and his increasingly unsettling presence. The hunting party was now effectively two separate groups as the trappers moved as far away from Fudd as possible. They traveled in silence for some time, until the barbarian jogged up to the trappers and asked a genuine question. "Anything that will attract it?" The question remained in the air for a few tense seconds, before Ronald grunted and narrowed his eyes as he thought about even answering. "Fresh kills," he finally replied. His tone was cold and short. "It's a predator, and it's drawn to the scent of blood." Ronald did not turn to look at Fudd as he stared ahead and continued his pace. Benton glanced back at Fudd after Ronald spoke, but quickly looked forward again. Harold remained silent as his eyes swept the shadows between the trees and ignored him. The barbarian felt the tension again and intentionally trailed behind the trappers as an appeasing gesture. After a time of intense silence, the air grew noticeably colder in the warm afternoon, and the sounds of the forest, suddenly, fell silent. Futt felt the presence of the hellhound by pure barbaric instinct, and smiled. He turned to Kenny, his expression unreadable as he leaned in and pressed a rough kiss to his cold, filthy forehead. A peculiar reverence settled over him for a moment. Then, with a grunt of effort, he hoisted the stiff corpse and secured the vine noose around a low-hanging branch of a sturdy oak. Kenny dangled as his lifeless eyes stared blankly into the woods. With his great axe, he carefully made the cut, and a small amount of blood from Kenny's arm began to flow. It trickled down his hide and pooled slightly on the ground below. A dark, metallic scent mingled with the pine and damp earth of the forest. Ronald froze mid-step as his eyes widened in absolute horror. He let out a choked gasp, then averted his gaze. His knuckles turned white as he gripped his own axe. Benton stumbled back as his face drained of color. Then he quickly turned it back and began to gag. Harold, who had been scanning the trees ahead, looked at Benton, then stopped and slowly turned. His usual stoicism cracked for a fleeting second and was replaced by a look of profound disgust and disbelief. He stared at Futt, then at the dangling, bleeding corpse. He turned his back again, his shoulders rigid with revulsion. The air around the barbarian was thick with the scent of blood and the stunned silence of his companions. A dour smile touched his lips as he addressed the trappers. "Now we wait," Futt said, his voice resonating with confidence. "The beast will come to us." Ronald visibly recoiled as his gaze flicked between Futt and the dangling corpse before snapping away with a shudder. "Aye, you'll wait," he muttered. His voice was tight with revulsion. "Benton, Harold, keep your eyes sharp, but you too." He pointed at Futt and Kenny. "You stay over there. We'll position ourselves where the wind ain't carrying." "That." Benton scrambled to comply, and he stumbled over his own feet to put more distance between himself and the macabre scene. Harold silently moved to flank a large cluster of ferns further up the trail, his back still turned. Futt was left alone with his grisly bait, and the silence of the forest was now thick with unspoken disgust and a new tension that had nothing to do with the skulking hellhound. Futt scanned over to where the trappers had moved. Ronald stood about 20 feet away, partially obscured by a thick growth of thorny bushes. He held his head high as he tried to ignore the scent of blood carried on the faint breeze. Benton had positioned himself even further, almost 40 feet distant. He was nervously peering around the trunk of a massive moss-covered tree. Harold, the stoic, was perhaps 25 feet away. His back was turned as his eyes scanned the tree line in the opposite direction from Kenny. The trappers maintained a clear line of sight to the dangling corpse, but the tension was now measured by the physical gap between them. The barbarian ignored Ronald's request as he moved towards his position. The dry leaves crunched softly under his boots as Ronald stiffened at his approach. His eyes narrowed, but he did not shift his aim from the dangling goblin. His grip on the bull tightened and his knuckles turned white. Futt looked at the weapon and saw it was long and well worn. Its dark wood was polished smooth from years of use as it gleamed dully in the dappled light. It looked heavy, clearly built for power rather than quick movement. "That's a fine piece," Futt said as he nodded towards the bow. "Good for hunting something big, I reckon." Ronald exhaled slowly through his nose, his gaze still fixed on the corpse. "It's seen its share of beasts," he admitted. His voice was flat and still lingered with impatience for the barbarian. "Keeps 'em at a distance. That's all you need to know." He did not elaborate, his attention unwavering and clearly still uncomfortable with Futt's proximity in the earlier display. Futt continued staring at Ronald's bow and realized the longer he looked at it, the more he wanted it. The bow was clearly of good make. It was carved from dark, dense wood, possibly oak or walnut, and showed signs of careful maintenance, though it bore the scuffs and marks of frequent use in the wilderness. It was not a finely ornamented piece for parade, but a tool of serious purpose, likely accurate and powerful. Ronald glanced at Futt as he eyed the bow. His expression was unreadable, but he did not pull away. The others remained where they were, their own vigil unbroken. The air was still, save for the occasional breeze and the rustle of leaves that came with it. The suspense, both from the potential arrival of the hellhound and the strained alliance, was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Do you think using Kenny as bait was a good idea?" "I don't want him getting hurt," Futt blurted as he looked at Ronald with a serious expression. The question was proposed as a genuine concern for Kenny, and had colored the barbarian's tone with grief. Ronald visibly flinched and his jaw clenched. He turned his head slowly, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and bewildered disbelief as he stared at him. A low, strangled sound escaped his throat, a sound of pure exasperation. "Hurt?" he finally managed. His voice was loud and it was laced with utter incredulity. "Buckerson, it's a dead goblin. It's been dead for days. What the hell are you talking about? Getting hurt?" The other trappers overheard this exchange, and Benton made an agonized groan from his position as he buried his face in his hands. Harold let out a long, slow sigh, a sound of profound resignation. He shook his head slowly and fixed his gaze on the distant trees, as if wishing he could simply disappear from this madness. The silence that followed was heavy with the unsettling knowledge that Futt's companions were now convinced that he was completely unhinged. "So you think Kenny will be okay?" Ronald stared at him with an expression of profound, almost cosmic, weariness. His eyes twitched silently for a moment. He looks at Kenny, then back at Futt. "Buckerson," Ronald began, his voice low and slightly condescending. "Kenny is a corpse. He is, quite emphatically, not okay. He is dead. He has been dead for days. He has had a map carved into his back and a stick rammed down his throat. He is covered in shit, and he is currently hanging from a tree by a noose, with blood dripping from his arm. He will not be okay. He will be exactly as he is now until he rots away." Benton took a step back and shook his head, as if trying to dislodge a disturbing image. Harold remained silent, but he picked up a small stone and tossed it absently into the undergrowth, his expression firm. The message was clear. Futt's perception of Kenny's well-being was a source of deep concern for them, and not in a way that was flattering to the barbarian. "Okay, jokes aside, do you think he'll be all right, though?" Ronald pinched the bridge of his nose, and a long, slow exhale escaped him. He looked at Futt as his eyes held a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue. "Buckerson," he said. His voice was as dangerously low as his patience was thin. "We've just been over this. Kenny isn't gonna be all right. He's a goddamn corpse. He's fucking bait. Look, he is whatever the fuck you want him to be in your fucked up head. But in reality, he's a dead fucking goblin you've strung up in a goddamn tree. The only thing that matters is whether this bait draws the beast." He turned his attention back to the surrounding woods and readied his bow. "If you're done, then focus. Keep your eyes open. That's all that matters now." Futt looked at Ronald and gently shook his head. He pretended to be disappointed, but in reality, he was trying to hold back a laugh. The message was clear. Futt's peculiar humor was wearing thin, and their patience was running out. Futt shifted his gaze from Ronald to the other two trappers. Benton still looked pale and nervous, and clutched a sturdy hunting knife in one hand, similar to Harold's, but perhaps a bit smaller. His other hand was occupied with his bow. It was a short, powerful yew-bow, slung across his back, ready for quick deployment. He seemed more adept with ranged weapons, likely for smaller game, but the knife indicated a preparedness for close encounters. Harold, further off, had his hunting knife clearly visible. Its handle was worn smooth. He also had a heavy woodcutter's axe, strapped to his belt, its edge well honed. It was a practical tool for felling trees, but also a formidable weapon in a pinch, suggesting he's prepared for more than just tracking. Futt simply nodded in silence after his assessment of the trapper's equipment as he went to find his own position to wait. He found a large tree surrounded by thick ferns and decided to wait for the beast. The afternoon wore on and slowly bled into a twilight that deepened with an unsettling speed. The dappled sunlight gave way to lengthening shadows, and a chill began to creep through the forest as the last vestiges of daylight faded. The forest fogged and fell into an eerie stillness. The distant calls of nocturnal creatures only served to heighten the tension. The trappers became mere silhouettes against the encroaching darkness, their forms unmoving and watchful. Futt remained hidden near the dangling corpse of Kenny. He held his great axe ready as the forest around him transformed into a darker, more dangerous domain. Suddenly, a new scent cut through the night. It was a foul, metallic odor, like stale blood and damp earth, stronger than Kenny's own. It was followed by a soft, almost imperceptible scrape, like claws on bark. It came from the deep shadows, just beyond visibility. A low, guttural huff echoed too close and vibrated in the very air around him. The hellhound had finally come. Futt strained his eyes and tried to pierce through the oppressive darkness that shrouded the forest. He looked to the direction of the sound, but the shadows writhed and coalesced. The darkness refused to yield a clear image of the beast. All he saw was a fleeting impression of something massive and low to the ground. A darker-than-night shape that seemed to melt back into the gloom as soon as his gaze attempted to fix upon it. The scrape of claws sounded again, closer this time, and the foul, musky scent intensified and assaulted the barbarian's senses. Ronald tensed, and his breathing was now a barely audible hiss. He did not move, but his bow shifted almost imperceptibly as he aimed towards the unseen threat. From their distant positions, Benton let out a terrified whimper, and Harold's silent vigil seemed to heighten as his body stiffened. The hellhound remained frustratingly hidden. The predatory presence was felt more than seen as it lurked just beyond the veil of darkness. Futt tried to gauge who among the trappers were nearest to the source of the sounds. Ronald was across from him by 10 feet. separated by the rough road they had traveled. The hellhound's guttural huffs and the scraping sounds seemed to emanate from the deep shadows directly ahead, perhaps 20 yards away, and slightly to the left, in the direction Ronald was facing. Benton was considerably further back, a mere silhouette against a distant tree, and Harold was also some distance away, positioned behind a fallen log to the right. Both Futt and Ronald were the closest to the unseen beast, sharing the immediate front line of this tense standoff. The barbarian tried to sneak closer towards Ronald, but his attempt to move silently was betrayed by a sharp, unmistakable crack of a dry twig beneath his boot. The sound, amplified in the suffocating stillness of the night, sliced through the tension. Benton let out an audible choked gasp and stumbled further into the meager cover of his tree. Harold, who had been a statue of grim vigilance, visibly tensed as his head snapped towards Futt's position with an expression of pure exasperation. Ronald whirled towards him with his bow still trained forward, but his voice was a strained hiss. "Buckerson, don't move!" His command was just a whisper, and his frustration was evident. The sudden noise, however, had not gone unnoticed by the unseen hunter. The foul scent intensified, and a low, rumbling growl answered the sound. It was followed by the heavy thud of something large as it moved through the undergrowth, drawn by the disruption. The barbarian muttered a curse under his breath as he rose from his compromised position. He made a low rumble, and it increased in volume and intensity that developed into a primal roar that echoed through the dark forest. His eyes blazed with an unbridled fury as he charged headlong towards the unseen threat, his great axe raised high as he prepared to strike the lurking beast. Futt did not see the hellhound until it was right in front of him. It was the shape and size of a large bear, built of solid muscle. It seemed to swallow any light with its terrible presence. Its deep red eyes blazed with anger and instilled fear into whoever stared into them. It had thick and massive quills jutting from its back, as sharp and as long as swords. Its long snout snarled at him, revealing its enormous pitch-black canines. "Oh, fuck!" the barbarian roared. The great axe, heavy with the fury of his rage, crashed into the hellhound's neck. The beast howled in pain, and a deep gash now marred its dark hide. Its blood was as dark as night as it flowed from the wound. It stumbled back, and its abysmal eyes radiated hellfire as it glared at the barbarian with renewed malice. But it was still standing. The trappers watched from the periphery, frozen in fear, their unease palpable in the oppressive silence of the forest. The hellhound slashed furiously with its claws, but the barbarian had sidestepped as the clumsy attack whistled past his face. "A little help, guys?" the barbarian asked his reluctant companions as he took a step back. There was no reply from the trappers, and they remained where they stood. The fear that radiated from the hellhound held them in their horrified stupor. Ronald lowered his bow, and his eyes widened at the terrible creature. Benton sat down and hugged his knees as panic took hold of him. Harold's stoicism vanished as his face went pale and started mumbling incoherently. With a guttural roar, Futt threw caution to the wind and abandoned all defense for a brutal offensive. His great axe swung in a wide arc and embedded itself in the hellhound's eye. The grievous blow was immediately followed by the sound of a sickening crunch and smashed bone. The beast let out a final pained shriek as its limbs thrashed violently for a moment before it collapsed to the forest floor, utterly motionless. The immediate threat was neutralized, and a tense silence fell over the clearing, broken only by Futt's heavy breathing and the distant sounds of the forest. A torrent of thoughts flooded Futt's mind as he stared at the defeated beast. He furiously wondered why the trappers had not helped him in the brutal fight. He thought about the promise to split the reward between them, and believed they did not deserve it. He felt the only reward they deserved was death. After all, he had done all the work. With his newfound resolution, his eyes snapped forward, and his gaze held nothing in particular, save for the crazed look of a hungry predator with the intent to kill. He grinned wickedly and roared at the top of his lungs. "Help me!" The unhinged plea for help, intended to beckon his companions towards him, only amplified their fear.